Hi everyone, my name is Rachel and I'm on the pastoral team at the Way Church here in Vancouver, and we're so glad that you've decided to tune in today. Our prayer is that the message that you're about to listen to strengthens you and helps you take a step in your discipleship towards Jesus. And each week throughout the summer, our teaching team has been invited to share a message that's particularly on their hearts, and so we hope that it encourages you and helps you see Jesus more clearly. We'll talk soon.
Good morning. Our scripture reading this morning is from Daniel 3, 1-19. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image he had set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and peoples of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshiped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your Majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your Majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your Majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your Majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual. I'd like to invite Chris up.
Thanks, Ben. That was a long passage, and you read it beautifully. A lot of repetition as well. Let me give you context for the passage we heard read. In the 5th century BCE, the 2 tribes of Judah, the 2 southern tribes, had been conquered by Babylon, and the people had been carried into exile. And at the time, the prophet Jeremiah told the people in exile to, quote, "Build houses and settle down, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters, increase in number there, don't decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile, Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. These were their marching orders while in exile. And some of the people listened to Jeremiah. They settled in, they learned the language, they rose to positions of authority and prominence to seek the prosperity of the empire. And 4 examples were men named Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They had very Jewish names. Their names meant Daniel, God is my judge; Hananiah, Yahweh is gracious; Mishael, who is like God; and Azariah, Yahweh has helped. And so their names had deep and profound meaning. Their names were attached to their faith, their relationship with God, their loyalty to Yahweh above all. But once they began to be trained in the ways of Babylon, their names were changed by a Babylonian official. Daniel to Belshazzar, which means Bel's prince; Hananiah to Shadrach, which means friend of the king; Mishael to Meshach, which means guest of the king; and Azariah to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. The dominant culture renamed them. Your names are now connected to the Babylonian gods and the Babylonian king. This is where your loyalty must lie. And in chapter 3 of Daniel's book, his 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, find that their loyalty to Yahweh is put to the test. And for all of us, there are moments when our faith is put to the test. Moments where the dominant culture is trying to rename us, demand our loyalty, ask us to bow our knees. Moments when our trust in God is challenged. There are moments when we realize our faith might cost us a relationship, a job, a promotion, a grade, an invitation to something. It might invite ridicule or turn us into a pariah or an outcast. There are places in the world where it costs people their very lives. And this was the situation of Daniel's friends. How did they respond? Well, let me read it to you once again. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." This is punk rock. This is nonconformity. This is a refusal to bow the knee. You intend to harm us, and God is able to save us from you. But even if he does not, we will not forsake our God. We haven't forgotten our true names and what they mean. This is resilient faith in the face of pressure. And that's what I want to talk about. Resilient faith in the face of pressure. It applies to many situations, in persecution and in the trials of life. It is gritty, honest, costly, life in the trenches, backbone of steel type of faith. God is able to heal my disease, but even if he does not, God is able to provide the job I want, but even if he does not, God is able to bring that child back to himself, but even if he does not, there is a thorn in my flesh. God is able to remove it. I've asked him 3 times to do so, but even if he does not, his grace is sufficient. His power is made perfect in weakness. This is gritty, honest, costly, life in the trenches, backbone of steel type of faith. It is a resilient faith. Come hell or high water, I will trust in you. Come feast or famine or flood, I will trust in you. Resilient faith under pressure. And so in light of this topic or theme, I want to ask and attempt to answer a question. And here it is. How did they? How did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, how did they cultivate such courage and faith? How did they do it? How did they find the courage not to bow? And what I want to do is step back from the story and suggest 3 things from the wider narrative to answer that question. How did they find the courage? How did they find that resilient faith to stand up in the face of intense pressure? And so here are the 3 things I want to look at, or the 3 things I want to suggest to you as fuel for their courage and resilient faith. First, Daniel's friends remembered the past. Second, Daniel's friends understood the cost of disobedience. And then third, Daniel's friends knew the end of their story. Remembered the past, understood the cost of disobedience, and knew the end of their story. That's the map for the message. And so first, Daniel's friends remembered the past. So all throughout Scripture, God tells his people to remember. Remember me, remember the Lord, remember what I've done. I'll give you some examples. Exodus 13, verse 3. Remember the day you came out of Egypt, the land of slavery, because the Lord brought you out with a mighty hand. Nehemiah 4:14. Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. This is from Psalms. Remember the wonders he has done, his miracles, and the judgments he pronounced. So again and again, there's this drumbeat. Remember who God is. Remember what God has done. Don't forget. And Daniel's friends, they didn't have to reach back that far. They didn't have to reach back to the Exodus. They didn't have to reach back to God bringing his people into the promised land. All they had to remember was what God did earlier in the book of Daniel. So earlier in the story, in chapter 2, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. You can read chapter 2 later. But it was a dream that disturbed him, and he wanted it interpreted. But he didn't want to tell anyone the dream. So that's a lot of pressure. I want you to interpret my dream, but I'm not going to tell you what the dream is. You tell me what I dreamed, and then tell me what it means. So again, someone has to first correctly discern the nature of the dream and then give the proper interpretation, and failure to do so meant the death of all the wise men in the land. So the king was a tyrant, as we can see. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, their lives had already been on the line. But if you read chapter 2, you see God gave Daniel miraculously both the dream and the interpretation of the dream. In other words, God moved in a miraculous supernatural way, and their lives were spared. They knew that God worked in miraculous ways. They knew that God was present and aware of their circumstances. They just had to remember the past to find courage in the present. Their experience in chapter 2 prepared them for chapter 3. Have you had those moments in your relationship with God where God seems so present, where God seems so involved, so near? He delivered you, he provided for you in a remarkable way, in a dramatic way, or maybe even in less surprising, more everyday ways. Many of us have had experiences like that. And because Daniel, it's a dramatic story, I'll tell you a more dramatic story from our community. And I have permission to share this story. I have permission to use the man's name, but I'm still not going to use the name. But this is a story from our community. Months ago, I had lunch with a man who shared this with me, and afterwards I wrote it down because I was so impacted by it. And the story takes place at a Superstore Parkade in Surrey. And it was 3:30 a.m., and he had overdosed on crack cocaine. And he told me that though he thought the crack was clean, about 3/4 of the way through, he realized it was laced with fentanyl. And he realized at that moment that he was going to die. And he tried to get on his bike to ride for help, and that's the last thing he remembered. until he woke up with paramedics staring down at him. And alongside the paramedics were an older couple with their dog. And he didn't want to go to the hospital, and he was getting up to leave when the older woman said to him, "Before you go, can I ask you a question?" And he said, "Sure." She asked, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And he said, "Yeah, I believe in God, but I'm not sure what his plans and purposes are for me." And then she told him a story. She said, "I'm glad you believe in God or Jesus because it will make it easier for you to believe what I'm going to tell you. Our dog has a bladder problem, so every morning at 3:30 a.m., my husband and I have to get up and walk the dog or he will pee all over the house." Sounds worth it. And so we take the same route every night without fail. And tonight we were walking the same route we always walk, and I believe God took me by the hand and started leading me to this parkade, which wasn't on our route. My husband was behind me asking, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" But I had total peace about the direction I was heading, the woman talking. She goes, "I felt like I was being guided. I didn't see you from a distance, but I was led straight to you. I saw you were unresponsive, so I called the ambulance. They arrived, they brought you back to life. So before you go, I just wanted you to know that God led me to you tonight, and he wants you to live. He wants you to live. Mark the moment when temptations come, when you mess up again, when things seem so hard. Remember, God wants you to live. Remember." This man recently told me he just bought a puppy. I don't know if it's connected. Like the book of Daniel, that's a rare story. And you might not have a story like that to remember and look back to. Our stories are so different. But God has given all of us the cross. God has given all of us the death and resurrection of Jesus. And every week we remember what God has done for us in Jesus. We remember the forgiveness of sins. We remember that God has met our deepest needs. Even if God doesn't deliver me in the moment, even if God doesn't do what I want, even if I don't understand what he's up to, even if the cost seems too high and the reward seems too abstract, I will not bow my knee. I will remember, I will trust. I know who my God is. I know what he's done. I will trust in him. I will remember what God has done in the past through Jesus to find courage in the present for Jesus. And so what we see in the story is Daniel's friends, they remembered the past. They knew who God was. They knew what God had done. Their confidence was well placed. Here's the second thing. Daniel's friends understood the cost of disobedience. And so this story took place, as I said earlier, while the nation was in exile, the two tribes of Judah. Jerusalem was ruined. The temple was in shambles. And they knew why. The prophets had pleaded with them, warned them for decades and decades about the consequences of their sin, that judgment would come. And I'll just read you two excerpts from the prophet Jeremiah. This is from chapter 5. God is speaking through the prophet. "Among my people are the wicked who lie in wait like men who snare birds, and like those who set traps to catch people. Their evil deeds have no limit. They do not seek justice. They do not promote the cause of the fatherless. They do not defend the just cause of the poor. Should I not punish them for this, declares the Lord?" Or in chapter 2 of Jeremiah, you really catch this lament. You catch God's heart, his yearning almost. This is what the Lord says. "What fault did your ancestors find in me that they strayed so far from me? They followed worthless idols and became worthless themselves. They did not ask, 'Where is the Lord who brought us out of Egypt?' The priests did not ask, 'Where is the Lord?' Those who deal with the law did not know me. The leaders rebelled against me. The prophets prophesied by Baal, following worthless idols. Be appalled at this, you heavens, and shudder with great horror, declares the Lord. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and they have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." They've forsaken me. They've rebelled. They've bowed their knees to false gods. And after decades and decades of warning and unrepentant sin, Judah is carried into exile. And so Daniel's friends knew the consequence of sin. They were living it. It's like, why not bow your knee to the pagan king? Why not worship an idol made of gold? Well, because they knew where that leads. Like bowing our knee to foreign gods, acting wickedly, forsaking our loyalty to Yahweh, it's what got us here in the first place. That's why we're in this situation. The solution is not worshiping more golden idols or images, right? They remember the golden calf. It's like if you stick a fork in your eye, the hope is you learn from that experience and don't do it again. And so they knew the consequences of sin. Do we? And I know we don't like the word because it seems archaic or offensive or overtly religious, but we see the consequences of sin all the time. Ill health, the breakdown of relationships, the preying on the vulnerable, violence, apathy, all kinds of evil. Sin, like Satan, always comes to steal, kill, and destroy. If we're not putting sin to death, sin is trying to put us to death, always. I remember years ago I read Dostoevsky's book, Crime and Punishment. You know, these Russian novels where the characters have 3 different names and it's so long and confusing. So I read it, and just so I could say that I read it. I do a lot of things like that. So one of the main characters, Raskolnikov, in the story, he eventually confesses his murders to Sonia, another character. And her first response is fascinating. I'll give it to you in the original Russian. No, I will not. I can't do that. She says, "What have you done to yourself?" First response. In the words of one theologian, this is how sin works. Sin always carries its own punishment. Sin is self-inflicted. Sin is a self-inflicted wound upon our soul. And sin leads to alienation. Sin is a form of exile always. It alienates me from God, from others, from my true self. It's not just an exile from heaven, it's an exile from wholeness. And the good news is that Jesus lived without sin and then died for our sin on the cross. That sin is a self-inflicted wound, but by his wounds we are healed. And when Jesus cried out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" He was experiencing exile from the Father's presence in our place so that we could be welcomed home into the Father's heart. And Jesus did this for us. This is what our disobedience cost him. And I've always loved these words from Charles Spurgeon. He writes this. He said, "If Christ has died for me, ungodly as I am, without strength as I am, then I can no longer live in sin, but must arouse myself to love and serve him who has redeemed me. I cannot trifle with the evil that killed my best friend. I must be holy for his sake." We see the cost of disobedience every time we look to the cross. But we also see the grace and love of God overcoming it. And I can't trifle with the evil that killed the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. I can't bow my knee to you when Jesus already bled for me. My ultimate allegiance is to him. And so Daniel's friends, they knew the cost of disobedience. And so must we. It will keep us from sin. Number 3. I'm back, and I'm intense. So number 3, Daniel's friends knew the end of their story. Daniel and his friends were in exile, but they knew that restoration was coming. They knew that rescue was on its way. They knew that God had not abandoned their people. And so the prophets, they promised exile, but they also promised restoration and return. And so at the start of this talk, I quoted this letter from the prophet Jeremiah, Jeremiah 29, where Jeremiah says, hey, settle in, increase in number, seek the prosperity of the city. As that letter goes on, Jeremiah also says this, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my good promise to bring you back to this place, back to the land. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. And so God had already kept his promise about exile. They had every reason to believe God would keep his promise about rescue. And God did. And so Daniel's friends knew that whatever happened in the moment, their story, the story of their people, would not end in exile. Exile would not have the last word. Hope was on the horizon. In 2011, the Canucks went to the Stanley Cup. All right, it's a hard turn, but they were first place in the NHL that year, but in the first round, they faced the Chicago Blackhawks. And Chicago had beat us the last 2 years in the playoffs. We could not get past them. And in 2011, we were up 3-0 in the first round, and then Chicago won 3 games in a row. And in Game 7, the Canucks were up by 1 goal, and then with less than 2 minutes left in the third period, Jonathan Toews scored to tie the game, and the collective anxiety of the city went through the roof. And overtime was so stressful. How could we lose to this team again? Inconceivable. And then it happened. One of the best things that has ever happened to me. Jesus, my wife, children, this goal. And it was unbelievable. Alex Burrows scored in overtime. We lost our minds. We slayed the dragon. We beat Chicago. We went to the Stanley Cup. We lost. We rioted. Some people lost their jobs. Because it was like, is that Frank on top of a burning car? And then everyone saw Frank, and his life was ruined. And so, anyways, here's what's so interesting. A few years later, this is a true story, I rewatched that Jonathan Toews goal, the tying goal, on YouTube. And the emotional experience was entirely different. I didn't stress. I didn't freak out. I even smiled. Why? Because I knew the end of the story. I knew what was coming. And knowing the end of the story changed my experience of the middle. When you know the result of overtime, you don't freak out in the third period. Now, here's the same principle, the same idea, but let me raise the stakes higher, because a hockey game is silly and life is sometimes serious, and the stakes are often much higher. The author John Ortberg tells the story of a Christian teacher in Rwanda, a young Tutsi named Benyani. And he was a musician and a man of deep faith. Eventually, he became the headmaster of a school. And during the Rwandan genocide, when Hutus sought to kill Tutsis, armed Hutu soldiers came to his school with orders to execute all the teachers. And so they led Benyani and 11 other teachers away from the school. And one teacher broke down and cried out, "Please kill me first. I can't bear to see my friends die like this." Benyani spoke up and said, "Oh no, I am the leader. They will kill me first, and you will see what a glorious thing it is to go home and be with God." And then he turned to the soldiers and said, "May I pray for you?" And they were taken aback, but they allowed him. And he prayed not for deliverance, but for courage and that God would watch over their families. He prayed for the soldiers, quote, "They're about to do a terrible thing and will soon face unbearable guilt. Please send someone to tell them about Jesus so they can know forgiveness." Then when they arrived at the hill of execution, he had one more request. "Before you kill us, I would like to sing one final song." And he was permitted, and he began to sing a song he loved very much. Some of the lyrics go like this: "Out of my bondage, sorrow, and night, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come. Into thy freedom, gladness, and light, Jesus, I come to thee." And his teachers gained courage, and they joined in the singing. They sung these words: "Out of thy fear and dread of the tomb, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come. Into thy freedom, gladness, and light, Jesus, I come to thee." This hymn was Benyani's last song. How do we know this story? Well, the lieutenant, the leader of those soldiers, found himself even later that day plagued by guilt and despair. And he waited until night, and he found an old Quaker teacher who lived nearby and told her the story and then said, "I must know what would enable men to die like that." And she told him about Jesus, and months later he became a follower of Christ and started Bible studies and spread the story of Benyani and his last song. Eventually he was also executed. As Ortberg writes, if Benyani, quote, "had waited until the crisis hit to find a faith that could enable him to face death with such a spirit, it would have been too late. It was an extraordinary life before the crisis came that allowed him to meet it as he did." And this was a man who knew the end of his story. "Out of thy fear and dread of the tomb, Jesus, I come, Jesus, I come. What can a dictator do to me? What can an insecure king or a self-righteous mob do to me, ultimately? What can a faceless person hiding behind a keyboard do to me? Their strongest weapon is the threat of death, but what if we believe in resurrection? You know, in the early church leaders had to dissuade people from seeking martyrdom. That's how unafraid of death they were. They were seeking martyrdom, and pastors and theologians had to be like, "What are you doing? Quit it. That's not the way to go about this. Stop seeking it." Today, we've swung almost entirely in the other direction. Death is now like the worst thing that can happen, the thing to be avoided at all costs. And I think the Apostle Paul in Philippians 1 has the right balance and attitude. He says these words: "I eagerly expect and hope that I will in no way be ashamed, but will have sufficient courage so that now, as always, Christ will be exalted in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I'm going to go on living in the body, this will mean fruitful labor for me. Yet what shall I choose? I do not know. I'm torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it's more necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith." I'm happy to live. I love being here. I love serving others. I love the beauty. I love the laughter. I love using my gifts. It will be fruitful labor for me. But I'm even happier to die. That's Paul. To live is Christ, to die is gain. You cannot force that man or that woman to bow the knee. Prison, I will talk to prisoners about Christ. Out of prison, I will live for Christ. Torture me, I will share in the sufferings of Christ. Kill me, I will go to be with Christ. God can deliver me, but even if he doesn't, I will not bow the knee. Christ is my life, not your opinion of me. Christ is my life, not that promotion. Christ is my life, not that grade. Christ is my life, not that standard of living. Christ is my life, not my appearance in the mirror. Christ is my life, not a perfect family with straight A children. Christ is my life, not achieving all my goals. Christ is my life, not 80 years on the planet. If anything else is our life, only then is death truly dying. Then we will always be tempted to bow our knees in the face of cultural pressures because all those other things can be taken from us. But if Christ is our life, we are free to live radically even in the face of pressure and cost. Our God is able to rescue us. But even if he does not, we will not bow the knee. That's resilient faith in the face of pressure. How do we find it? Well, maybe not all at once. Maybe through a journey of remembering what God has done in Jesus, remembering the cost of sin to Jesus, and remembering the end of our story, resurrection through Jesus. Because that will fuel resilient, gritty faith in the present. The type of faith we need in the face of whatever comes.
Well, we hope today's message was encouraging for you. And if you want to hear more or connect into the life of the church, you can find out all of the information at thewaychurch.ca, and we would love to hear from you.